This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mrs. Fola Smith, interviewed by Rolland, Kerns in Henrietta, Oklahoma on March 28, 1972. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on March 16, 1990 by Joel Todd.
This is Rolland Kerns at Henrietta, Oklahoma on March 28, 1972, interviewing Mrs. Fola Smith, whose maiden name was Corda Summers. Mrs. Smith was born, I believe, right here in Henrietta or near there, and we will let her, to start with, tell about her birthplace and her early life here near Henrietta.
I was born in 1894 and came to live about 3 miles west of Henrietta. Dad was part Indian, and he got a 160-acre allotment. On this allotment, he built a little shack, and there we lived till 1916, when Dad built a new home about a half a mile from his old home. When we first settled out there, I remember the grass was higher than a man's head, and we had been there about 2 days when the Indians came around watching to see who we were and what we were doing. And they did that for about a week. And finally, Dad put a white rag on a stick and went out to talk with them. Of course, they talked Creek, and Dad didn't know any Creek. But anyhow, they, between themselves, by signs and things, Dad made it known that he wanted to settle there. And so they wanted to know by their signs, wanted Dad to know by their signs what they wanted. And so he gave them $2.50 in money and an old double-barrel shotgun, muzzle-loading shotgun. And they were tickled, and after that, the Indians never showed up anymore that we know of. And so we lived there until finally he built us a pretty good home to live in for those days. And that's where I was born, in this old home.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had 4 brothers and 3 sisters, and we all lived to be grown, except one. Well, he was grown, but he only was 21 years old.
You mentioned that your father was part Indian. I wonder if you could tell us how much Indian he was and of what tribe.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead.
my father was an 8th Creek Indian, or in those days they called them the Muskogees. And they came up, Mother and Dad were born in Alabama and came to Texas and lived till 1889 when they came to the Indian Territory.
You, being part Indian, no doubt never had any difficulties with the Indians then.
No, after he gave them the muzzle-loading shotgun and 2.5 money, they never bothered us anymore. And Dad had more friends of Indians in the early days than there were white people around here.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. Did you start raising all of your own food supplies from the very first year that did you stake out a claim? Is that what you did here?
Yes, we staked out a claim 160 acres, and as each child was born, they got 160 acres. And we were registered in Muskogee. And Dad raised, of course, was a farmer, a cotton farmer, but it wasn't too long before he got to raising cattle, and he would drive these cattle to St. Louis or Kansas City till the railroads came in. And I think the railroad, the Frisco Railroad, came through Henrietta in about 1901. But we lived on a trail that they brought the cattle up from Texas, herded them up from Texas to Kansas City or St. Louis, whichever one they faced. And they used to bed their cattle down on Dad's land because there was water and plenty of grass.
Which way from Henrietta is your place?
We're about 3 miles due west of Henrietta, close to the Highway 75 and 66.
Did you ever lack for anything as far as food, shelter, or clothing was concerned from the very first years that you were here?
Oh, yes, we did. But Dad he would go to Texas about every 3 or 4 years and bring up a big barrel of ribbon cane syrup. And we'd have, of course, we raised our own corn, and we would crush our own meal, but we had to go to Shakota to buy our staples, our flour and sugar and salt.
Was Shakota as large or larger than Henrietta at that time?
Oh, no. No, it wasn't. It was just a small place, but they did have a cotton gin and a grocery store and a little old post office.
Did you have any difficulty with water supplies in those days, as we sometimes do in these days where there are droughts?
Well, I don't think so. I don't remember it because there was a nice stream of water that went down through Dad's place, and he finally found a spring so that we could get a well drilled. Well, we had to carry the water about a quarter of a mile, though, from this spring, and we made us a homemade wagon with wooden wheels that we'd haul the water up from this spring, and we children would.
My earliest memories of Henrietta were shortly after I moved to Muskogee in 1921, and at that time there were, as I remember, coal operations or some kind of mining and smelting. Could you tell us your early memories of that, please?
The coal mining? Well, I went to school down to Old Crow Creek schoolhouse, that's what we called it then, and we had to go down through the mountains and right by where there was a creek mine was built. And they had, of course, for the miners, they had a store, for the miners to use. And we children used to bring eggs down there from home and sell to this little old store, 5 cents a dozen, if we got there with them. But half of the time, we'd break about half of them.
Well, can you remember when the first coal mine was shaft was sunk around Henrietta here?
Well, now there might have been some before the Coal Creek mine, you see. Those days we didn't have much way of getting around except in a wagon or a horseback. And I was pretty young, but I know the creek mine was built, it was opened around 108 or 9.
Is there a smelter here, or am I mistaken?
Well, there was a smelter here, but it's been torn down. Mm-hmm. But we still have a glass plant here.
Oh, you do?
Mm-hmm.
Have you any memories of any Indian difficulties that other people had with the Indians in the early days that you did not have?
Well, the only thing that I really remember is the Crazy Snake Uprising, and his name, the Indian that started it, was named Chico Harjo. And Chico means snake. So all of the white people got to calling him Crazy Snake because he was such foolhardy, and he got about 5,000 Indians to join his party, and that's about all I remember. But I'm telling you, the white people sure got busy getting their guns ready, but there wasn't any killing unless it was someone that I didn't know.
Whatever happened to Crazy Snake?
I don't remember that part.
Miss Smith, could you tell us about your earliest memories of your school life around Henrietta, and what type of instruction you had, books, and all about that?
Well, my first school that I ever went to was down to what we called Coal Creek Schoolhouse. And we had a Miss Alice Robertson was the Indian superintendent of all the schools around here.
Is that the Alice Robertson that lived in Muskogee and was later? I knew her.
Was a congresswoman.
Yes.
And Ms. Alice Robertson lived in Muskogee and later became a United States congresswoman. And we had men teachers mostly, no women teachers in those days. And we had about 3 subjects: reading and writing and arithmetic. And we had the old blueback speller. That's, I guess, the first speller that was ever given. And we children, usually in the springtime, and in the early fall, we would walk to school 3 miles. And in the wintertime, we usually rode a horse, 3 on a horse.
Well, that's pretty interesting, since children nowadays seem to feel if they don't have a car to ride 3 blocks to school in, that they're put upon. Did you ever hear of Mcguffy's Readers?
Yes, I've heard of it, and Mother and Dad used to have some, but some of the older children got it when we got through with it.
You did not use those in the school?
No, we didn't. We just had what they called a primer.
Was it a one-room school?
One-room school, and there were about 35 when they all came that come to school, but usually it's about 20 that was there every day.
How many grades?
They had the whole 8th grade. But, of course, they didn't have as many books now as they have in the 8th grade. And we had fun going and coming from school. And I remember in the spring we'd pick wild strawberries around the schoolhouse, and there were some Indian children that came that brought softies, what they called this soured corn. We call it hominy now, but they called it softies. And we had swapped them our biscuits and sausage in the fall of the year for some of their softies.
Why, was there much drunkenness among the Indians or among the miners during those days?
Well, yes, pretty much, but the miners mostly drank what they call chalk. But I don't know what that is. But the Indians, of course, didn't get much whiskey because they were a poor tribe. But the white men, a lot of them drank pretty much.
Could you tell us a little bit about the, for instance, whether you used slates in those days or paper tablets, and also what type of punishment was meted out to the students?
Well, we used slates mostly because we couldn't get to where we had any paper. Well, there was no paper here in Henrietta, no newspapers or no anything at that time. And so we used slates. And for punishment in school, of which I had it pretty often, was standing in the corner or staying in after school. And but I never got a whipping.
Did they have blackboards in those days?
Blackboards yes, we had blackboards, And I was usually the one that kept the backboard clean.
Miss Smith, you showed me a copy of an old 1939 paper that had a picture, among other people, of your son, I believe it was, that you said was born in 1914, and there was a headline story about a powwow that had been originated, and I believe your people helped originate. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, this was a kind of like an old Frontier Day program, and where the men had to let their mustache and whiskers grow real long, but if they didn't do that, they had to pay a fine or be dumped in this horse trough. And my son, Gordon Smith, got one of the prizes for the best looking whiskers.
Can you remember when the first streets were paved in Henrietta and where they were paved?
Well, they were paved about where Main Street is now, but the early streets, there wasn't no boards, no pavement. It was mostly mud when it rained, and it was hard to get through the street, and there wasn't but just 5 or 6 houses those days, and one of those was a bank, and my daddy gave $500 to John Sullins that started that bank, but Dad worried over that till he lost his health, but it came out all right, and but the streets were boards finally, just real narrow right up and close in front of the stores. But I don't remember when the pavement was really put in.
Did they have any board sidewalks?
Well, no board sidewalks. They just had the stores didn't have any porches, what we call porches. And they just had this little walk right up close to the stores. Wasn't really a sidewalk, but I guess it would be called a sidewalk too. After Old Coal Creek Schoolhouse was disbanded, why, Dad gave an acre of land and built a schoolhouse out there about a half a mile from where his old first home was in the Indian Territory days. And that we built his schoolhouse in 1907. And there's where I went till I finished the 8th grade. And then we rode to town in a buggy, my two sisters and I, to school after the 8th grade. And that's where we all finished our school, was at Henrietta.
Did they have a Henrietta High School then at that time?
Yes, we had a Henrietta High School at that time, but it was what they call now the old Lyceum building. But it was all just one room.
Did you have football games or any sports of that kind in those days?
Well, we didn't have football, but we had baseball and basketball, and I was on the girls' team of the baseball team.
That's unusual.
Yes, it is. But we beat the boys most of the time. Yes, we did.
Could you tell us, Miss Smith, if there were any oil operations around Henrietta in those early days, and if there were any other industries that sprang up?
Well, we didn't have any other. In 1912, I think the first oil well was drilled out on my oldest sister's place. And then my brother got an oil well or two on the place, but they were small. They didn't amount to much. And as far as the other business, I don't know of any except the mines, the coal mines.
About what year were these oil wells drilled?
Well, the first one was drilled in 1912. And of course, they came and rented all the other lands around there, too. Leased them. I guess you'd lease them.
Yeah, that's right. Miss Smith, you mentioned something about an interesting Palmer incident, and I wonder if you could tell us what that was.
Well, there was some outlaws, 4 of them came by Dad's place one evening kind of late, and they wanted to get some horses. And Dad didn't have any horses that he would sell them. He knew they were outlaws because they rode in so fast, and they thought there was a posse behind them, and they wanted something to eat, but Dad did feed them because he was afraid not to. But the horses, he put the 2 oldest boys in the house with their double-barrel shotguns, and he told them that they couldn't get their horses. And so they just eased in and left. But Dad told them when they was bragging about they had to have those horses, he said, well, you've got 2 shotguns pointed at you, so you better ride on off. So of course they didn't know how many there were in the house because Dad was the only one that showed up. None of us children, their mother or anybody, they didn't see nobody but Dad. So they went on, and they went about 6 miles north of where we lived, and found a fella out in the woods that was out hunting his hogs, and his name was Sam Palmer. So they tied him up to a tree and took his horse and his boots, or his shoes, and tied him to this tree. Well, this Palmer had been in the habit of getting on his horse and going a visiting a day or 2 at a time, so his family didn't miss him till about the 3rd day. And so they got out hunting him with all the neighbors, and they found him tied to this tree. And the ants had stung him, and his mouth was swollen till he couldn't talk, and his feet, they'd stole his shoes. And he described them, and they knew by the description, Dad did, that it was the same 4 men that had come to his house to get horses.
Well, I presume that Mr. Palmer got all right after that eventually.
Yes, he got all right after that, and he hunted then for several weeks trying to find these people to get his boots back, he said. That's what he wanted, to get his boots back.
He wasn't too concerned about the horse then.
No, he wasn't.
Why, in your early days, what kind of entertainment did they have around Henrietta here?
Well, in my early days, our entertainment was Sunday school in this schoolhouse that Dad had built, which was called Summers Chapel, because my father's name was Clinton Patrick Summers. And we had school, and we had singing, and we had what they call a literary and a debating society, of which all of us children that were home at that time participated in. And we had hay rides and picnics on 4th of July and days like that. And we'd have hay rides and go to box suppers. We had box suppers, and a prize for the prettiest girl and the ugliest boy is a useless thing. And, of course, everybody that lived within 5 or 6 miles came in their wagon.
Did the boys buy the box lunches, or sight unseen, or how did you do that?
Oh, yes. We had our names on the inside of the box. The girls took shoe boxes or whatever kind of box we could find, but it was mostly shoe boxes, and we covered them with crepe paper and put bows on them and put our lunch in them, and they bought them sight unseen. But the boys would try to get around and figure out the girls' box that they wanted, and so there was a awful nice boy that lived in the community by the name of Albert Stevenson. So he got around my sister Mary to ask her where my box was, and she told him when he come up, and he bid out 50 cents. Well, he didn't get the box because that was the only money he had was 50 cents. And I never will forget that. So he tried to trade with another boy there, but this other boy wouldn't trade either, so I didn't get to eat supper with him.
Can you remember where you first met your husband and some of your early life?
I first met my husband in about 1912 at the Summers Chapel Schoolhouse at a literary society. And we had a lady school teacher boarding with us that taught at this school. And she told me before we went to the literary society, she says, that Fola Smith is going to ask you for a date. And I said, well, I bet he don't get it. And she says, I dare you to date him. So I did and married him 2 years later.
Well, that's quite interesting. Do you think of any other entertainment? Did you have square dances, and did you have watermelons in this part of the country?
Oh, yes, we had watermelons, and that's where I met my husband. The first time was in me and my sister and a neighbor girl was in his watermelon patch stealing a watermelon. And he come down to watch us for a little while, and then he wanted to know where I lived and who I was, of course, and I told him, and so he got to coming over to Summers Chapel. He hadn't been coming there very much before that, because he had a schoolhouse over at what they called Old Spring Hill then, and that's where he went. It was closer to his home. And so we had brush arbors for our meetings, preachers when they had come, and we had these, what did you ask me? Oh, yes, they had square dances, but that's one thing that Dad never would let us go to square dances, except one time. He sent our hired man with Mary and I, my sisters, over about 3 miles or 4 to this square dance, but he told us if there was any drinking or anything like that for this boy that brought us home. So I got about halfway around one square dance with a young man that was drinking, so this hired man took me out and brought us home.
There's a little town called Dewar, just, I believe it's east of here, just a very few miles. Does that have any historical significance to Henrietta?
I don't know about that.
You don't know about Dewar?
No, but it was a lot later than Henrietta.
That, it came in a lot later than Henrietta, I see. Miss Smith, did you ever hear of or know about any lynchings in this part of the country in those days?
Yes, in 1908, we had a livery stable down close to the railroad tracks, Frisco Railroad tracks, and this nigger came in and wanted to rent a horse and buggy. And so this fella didn't know the Negro, and he was just passing through the country, so he didn't want him to take the horse and buggy. And the nigger says, I'm going to have that horse and buggy. But he didn't let him have it, but he killed the livery stable man, Colonel Bates, we called him. So it was on a Christmas Eve. Well, the white men here in town got on their horses and started after this Negro. Of course, he ran when he shot this man. And they caught the nigger and brought him back and hung him on I guess you'd call it a telephone pole, but there wasn't no telephones here. It was just a pole, just a long, high pole. And so they put a rope on this pole. Some man climbed it, which was never known who it was, but if you'd ask anybody who it was, they'd say it's old Grandpa Snow. But Grandpa Snow was real old and just had one arm. And to Dad's dying day, he never told us kids who climbed the pole.
Well, you also, I believe, mentioned that your uncle had a cotton gin and that there was an unhappy incident around there.
Yes, my Uncle Albert Furr had a cotton gin about 6 or 7 miles south of where Henrietta is now. And he, of course, ginned cotton. Well, a Negro brought in a load of cotton to sell, and it didn't weigh out what he thought it ought to weigh out. So he and my uncle got in an argument over the weight of this cotton, and he was going to have more money or else. So he shot my uncle in the stomach, and my brother Jim and Will Furr, the man's uncle that got shot, had to ride to Okmulgee about 15 miles just before dark to get a doctor to come to see Uncle Albert. But Uncle Albert didn't live through the night. But they did get there with the doctor.
Well, that's a sad situation and a sad incident to have to relate, but it is history. You've no doubt been other places throughout the United States, but in conclusion, let me ask you, do you know of any place in the United States that you'd rather live but Henrietta?
No, I don't, because I've been in most states of the United States on just trips, though, but and I've been up to see my son who lives in Minnesota several times. And I've been in Canada where he has a cabin. But I like to come back to close to where I was born, but I'm the only one of the children that stayed here. All the rest of them have moved away in Colorado and California and places like that.
Well, that's very interesting and a very good testimony to the type of living we have in Oklahoma. I certainly subscribe to that opinion. Thank you so much, Mrs. Smith, for a very interesting interview. This is Rolland Kerns signing off the interview at Henrietta, Oklahoma with Mrs. Fola Smith. Thank you. Ms. Smith, I believe that we left something out, and that was your remembrances of Jackson Barnett, who I believe lived right around here near Henrietta.
Yes, I remember him very well because he used to come by Dad's once or twice a month to get him a coal. He called it a coal of fire. A coal was. He'd asked my sister and I, for a coal, and we couldn't understand what he wanted. And finally, he showed us his pipe and picked up a little rock and put in it and wanted the coal. And so we figured out from that he wanted a coal of fire to light his pipe. But Dad never would let us kids ever give anybody any matches because the grass was so high we were afraid we'd get burned out. But this Jackson Barnett was not mentally intelligent in several ways. But finally he got struck rich oil on his land, and he was a very rich man. Well, there was a white woman that lived in Kansas City, came down here when she heard all about how rich he was. And he was living in a little old 2-room log cabin about 5 miles from where my daddy lived. And all he wanted to do was roam the woods and hunt and smoke. He loved to smoke. And so Dad, every time he'd come by, he'd usually give him a twist of what they called it then, a twist of tobacco. He just kept it. Dad didn't use it, but he kept it for this Indian because he wanted to keep in good humor with all the people around that lived here then. But this white woman came down from Kansas City or St. Louis, I've forgotten just exactly, but she brought a lawyer with her, she said, but everybody around here thought it was her husband and still believe it was her husband. And she finally got Jackson Barnett to marry him, and he came and talked to Dad, and he wanted to know what marrying was. And Dad tried to explain it to him, but he didn't understand. And so, she finally said she married him. She took him somewhere away from Henrietta, though, to do that. And she cleaned him up, though, and fixed up his house and lived there, her and this lawyer, she called him. But I'm pretty sure it was her husband. And she got most of his money, but he had already given quite a bit of sum, several $1,000s or more, to the Henrietta Baptist Church, because Carl O'Hornet was his guardian. After he got all this oil, he had to have a guardian. So Carl O'Hornet was his guardian, and Carl O'Hornet was a Baptist, and so he helped build anyway about $40,000 worth of the Baptist church. And finally, this woman moved him to California, and she moved Barnett Jackson, to California, and she got him several ponies. He was crazy about horses, as most Indians were in those days. And she cleaned him up, and I guess she did a good favor to him after all.
That's a mighty interesting anecdote, and I'm glad we added that on to the end of this interview, Ms. Smith. Again, this does terminate the interview with Mrs. Smith at Henrietta, Oklahoma on March 28th, 1972.